Okay, so welcome everyone to this first parallel session of our MES Conference 2021, which is supported from Dhaka, Bangladesh, while we are spread all over the world, obviously, and so we also welcome everyone from wherever you tune in today. And our today's topic for this session is microgridders in the global south. And so we actually have 4 experts with us who work in the business of microgrids in the global south, not limited to it, but mostly. And I would just like to introduce our 4 panelists today. So we have Nithya Menon. She's a product development lead with Okra Solar. And she says Okra hardware supports a P2P model, but our software is built around energy as a service. We try to position ourselves alongside microgrids rather than alongside pay-as-you-go solar home systems. Then we have Felix Boldt. He is the CEO of SolarWorX. And he says SolarWorX merges the concepts of centralized AC mini grids and decentralized solar home systems in a unique new approach. A decentralized DC microgrid that interconnects solar home systems to share energy on a village level. Then we have Ziganovic. He is the CFO of MES SOLshare. And his statement is a little bit longer, but it contains many important points. The energy future is fueled not by fossil fuels, but by democratization, by decentralization, and decarbonization. A future where we as users are empowered, where we are all prosumers and share our electricity house to house, neighbor to neighbor, coming from our rooftop PV panels and in-house battery storage. At SOLshare, we do that already today. Bangladesh combines 3 world records we are building upon: the biggest solar home system fleet, the biggest mobile money platform, and the highest population density. And what differentiates us, SOLshare, further is that we believe that local community ownership is critical, building on existing resources, and therefore for a startup, not needing to invest too much in CapEx is critical. And then our 4th panelist today is Victoria McIvor, and she's an analyst with Z Venture. This is a European-based VC that specializes in the energy system transition. And I asked her, what can the global north actually learn from the global south? And currently, she thinks that we as the global north can learn how to have and run a robust and reliable infrastructure, e.g. metering system at low costs. And in the future, she expects Global North to learn how to operate a successful P2P microgrid from the Global South, if that's not already the case today. So thank you all for coming. And we have now 10 minutes each to get some input from your daily work. And we're going to start with Nithya, who has also prepared some slides for us.
Right. Okay. So our company's mission is to make sure every household has access to energy and to make sure energy companies have profitable ways to reach each of these houses. A big problem is that remote communities come in all shapes and sizes. Some houses are far apart, some are close together. Load usage varies. Some want light bulbs and fans, others want to use fridges. For a microgrid developer, this makes laying out transmission lines and predicting loads challenging. It's too costly to connect homes that are far apart or in small clusters, so many homes get left behind. We've built an IoT solar charge controller to simplify and bring down the costs for the developer. It can be installed as a simple high-power solar home system, configured as either DC or AC output, and enabling loads as big as rice cookers and washing machines. When homes are close enough together, they can be wired up into a DC microgrid, and the interconnected pods automatically start sharing power, which reduces transmission and distribution costs. Our software algorithms optimize the power distribution, which increases reliability and decreases the required size of panels and batteries. Increased reliability means houses can use more power and experience fewer blackouts, which drives up revenues. And because our system is DC and fully decentralized, the power doesn't need to travel as far. As a result, the per connection cost comes down by over $300 compared to a traditional AC microgrid. And as demand grows, so does the network. The grid is fully modular. You can connect homes or scale up capacity just like plugging in Legos. In addition to the Okra pod, we sell a suite of software tools known as the Harvest platform as an ongoing service to address numerous other challenges that mini-grid developers face, from identifying sites and least cost electrification methods, all the way to sustainable operations and maintenance. Harvest is designed to make it easy for developers to reach last mile communities. Starting at the very beginning, the act of identifying potential sites is incredibly labor intensive. So we use machine learning to help pinpoint off-grid clusters and calculate detailed costings of different technology solutions, data that then makes it much easier to secure financing and plan procurement and network layouts. And with the click of a button on the Harvest platform, the automatically exported bill of materials specifies optimal battery sizes, cable sizes, even down to what screws would be needed, removing barriers of guesswork and uncertainty to get projects off the ground. The next challenge is reliably collecting revenue and increasing revenue over time. Our platform enables payments to be collected remotely, and because each Okra pod is IoT enabled, if houses don't pay, they're immediately disabled, which discourages non-payment. And as an added benefit to the grid owner, even if a household stops paying, their installed capacity is not wasted and continues to contribute to the overall grid. As far as actually setting tariffs, we offer highly flexible structures due to constraints that we've faced in different markets. That being said, we've seen the highest payment reliability and satisfaction with a flat rate prepaid model, which we first deployed in the Philippines a few years ago. But collecting energy payments hasn't proven enough to drive profitability. Pilot data revealed that productive users generate more than 75% of revenues, despite making up as low as 10% of houses. So we saw an opportunity to bundle appliance leasing with energy payments on our platform. Now developers can easily push appliances to communities without being burdened of the logistics of lease payments and without worrying that household might stop paying entirely. Because once an appliance lease starts, the repayment is deducted along with the energy bill automatically. And lastly, O&M costs are a huge problem. They can make or break the long-term success of microgrids. And especially since most customers are used to centralized architectures, we've put a strong focus on technology to make decentralized maintenance easy to adopt. We harness the incoming IoT data from each controller to detect patterns and translate the data into clear, actionable items for a local technician. Instead of sending costly engineers out to remote communities every time there's an issue, the grids can be operated locally. For example, in the top snapshot, we could manually see that the panels stopped generating all of a sudden, meaning that likely the wire came loose. But no one has time to monitor each house's data individually. Instead, our algorithms can immediately detect this problem and send it to the local agent, instructing them to the exact house and exact cable that needs attention. This keeps costs low and helps resolve issues quickly. When a house isn't getting power, the utility isn't getting money, and no one wins. Another alert that we generate is for power theft. From our experience in the Philippines, we know that as much as 10% of power is often stolen on the main grid, and we hear that that's much higher in many African markets. And when power is stolen, as we all know, revenue is lost. But we can detect if the battery is draining unexpectedly or if there's an imbalance in sensor readings. So far, we've detected and corrected at least eight instances of power theft, which helps the utility recover revenue and also ensures batteries are properly charged and discharged, which is crucial to protect their lifespan. Other examples of alerts include predictive, weather-driven blackout alerts, as well as alerts that highlight underutilized assets. And as we grow and enter new markets, we continue to expand these insights to adjust to the local context. So what does this all mean? It means 50% lower operations costs compared to a manual approach. And it means a straightforward way to come directly to the platform and immediately know what and where the most pressing issues are. Sometimes customers don't leverage this data and automation, so it's our job to make it as obvious as possible, using a lot of red, when revenues are lost, and then make sure customers have the right data and insights in front of them to turn things around. Looking beyond just the technology, every problem our technology is designed to solve comes together to form a sustainable business model. Energy utilities, energy companies are our direct customers who leverage our hardware and software solutions to then sell electricity to houses. Our biggest markets so far have been in Cambodia and the Philippines, where there continues to be over 2 million households highly suitable for this decentralized electrification. And looking ahead, just this week, actually, 2 of our team members reached Nigeria as we embark on entering multiple African markets for the very first time. And through the process of exploring a large number of new markets over the past many months, the primary challenge we continue to face is the regulatory frameworks. And this doesn't just inhibit our scale or anyone else's scale who, other companies. It means that millions of people are left without electricity. What we're seeing is that regulation isn't supporting growth in technology and business models. Mini grids are being forced to adhere to European grid standards, which means solutions like diesel generators that provide low quality power have remained the primary option for decades, shutting out newer, cheaper, and better quality solutions developed in the past few years. This hardly makes sense. The regulation should serve to boost the number of connections and the energy supply as fast as possible, not be there to force emerging markets to build out in the exact same way Europe and America did. This is the opposite of leapfrogging. In an ideal world, we would either see regulations lifted, letting the market charge the true cost of power, driving the private sector to energize houses at the lowest cost. Or we'd see subsidy tenders open to any technology that can meet the market specs, and then the best tech at the lowest cost would win, ultimately ensuring long-term benefit to the economy. In the interim of either of these extreme directions, it'd be hugely beneficial to at least identify regions beyond a 5-year grid extension plan and open these regions to private sector with basic safety and commercial fairness policies to adhere to. This would lower the barrier to start deploying innovative decentralized tech at scale, which can in turn help validate these technologies and tangibly demonstrate the role they play in reaching the last mile cost effectively. Moving the needle on regulation is a long process, but it's exciting to see forums like this one driving the conversation forward. If anyone listening has any ideas or opportunities they'd like to share, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, perfectly on time. And I just wanted to say for the audience, there is the Q&A tool. So whenever you have any questions to our panelists, please feel free to just put them in the Q&A tool, and then we will answer them in the Q&A session in the end. So thank you very much. And Felix would be next to tell us something about SolarWorX.
Great, super. Yeah, so I'm Felix, I'm the CEO of SolarWorX. We're coming more from the kind of solar home system side, deploying mostly systems in sub-Saharan Africa. And then more and more realized that there's also quite some potential in mini grids, but not the kind of mini grids typically are deployed in Africa. And that's why we're saying we are a manufacturer of DC microgrids and solar home systems. And I really like to go really focusing on the product side of things. And so yeah. So we are like, as I said, we are originally coming up with the idea of making a very lean kind of product. It's a solar home system that we like to say it stacks like Lego, it talks like Siri, and it can be installed like IKEA furniture. So the stacking is kind of demonstrated here. So as the pocket of the end customer allows it, energy can be gradually increased by adding energy, battery capacity or a solar capacity. The devices also talk in local language to the end customers because we are very often addressing an illiterate customer base in the rural areas. And also we are putting focus on digitization and have all the systems remotely monitored for end customer analytics in terms of defaults, maintenance, repair, forecasting certain situations, and of course also the mobile money interface for repaying those systems. And so there's a whole bunch of kind of products. It's just a small kind of like extract of what we're currently offering, but you can see it's entirely flexible. But yet this is a solar home system, and I'm coming to the mini grid approach a little later. So we're selling those products usually with a bunch of appliances, because what you do with the energy if you don't have the right appliances. And sadly, so to say, most of the systems are sold with a TV, but now we are trying to push more and more also into the productive use segment, offering solar water pumps, fridges, and also inverters for being able to plug in like regular AC appliances. And so here's like an insight on the IoT solution that we're currently providing to all our distributors. So you can see live data of individual system, such as battery voltage consumption data and so on. You can also use like our own token interface via the platform, so that you can remotely unlock the systems via the GSM network. So we are able to roam into basically worldwide every network using a global SIM card provider and an integrated GSM modem. But of course, also we realize that there is no point in reinventing the wheel in terms of the CRM systems that are already out there, provided by companies like Angaza, Solaris Off-Grid, or Pagey, that already come with a customer database and an interface to the local mobile network providers who are offering access to mobile money services, which is kind of key for making this business model working without money, without cash at least, so that end customers can remotely do a payment for their solar system installment rate, send this payment directly to the distributor, get a token and return it, and either cleared into the system or it's automatically being transferred by the GSM connection to the system, so it unlocks for a certain amount of time. So what's new to this now is that we are trying to interface now solar home systems and mini grids, and that's what we call the mesh. So it's a new development that is not yet in the field. So I don't have that yet, so much granularity of the data in terms of what tariff we're currently using, because we simply don't have the evidence yet. But we're currently setting up first pilot systems in Cameroon that are, at the moment in Cameroon being tested. So what is the mesh actually, and why does it make sense? So that there's tons of solar home systems going out there every year. Depending on which statistics you believe, it's around 10 million sales per year in the global house. And per month the consumption is relatively low. So for the systems that we are typically deploying, it's 5 to 10 kilowatt hours, which comes at an end customer overall cost of $300 to $700, and that's not only the energy system, but it's also the appliances around it, like TV and light bulbs and so on. The less kind of the energy access is insufficient in terms of the tier electrification levels defined by the SDG 7. But then on the other hand, we have AC mini grids, which kind of provide a better electrification. But if you really look into the data, you see that the consumption per household, unless, as Nithya already explained, you have substantial anchor load in the systems, is not that high. So you're also only talking about 8 kilowatt hours per month roughly. But the installation cost on a regular AC mini grid is tremendously higher than the one of a solar home system. So how can we kind of merge the best out of two worlds? That's the question, and we answered that with the mesh. So like solar home system plus grid equals the mesh. So we kind of have this broader range of electrification. We really have like lesser power cuts. We have more power availability for a fraction of the connection cost as we would have it in an AC mini grid. So we are enabling solar home system customers to trade their surplus energy with neighbors that either have their own solar home system, but the energy is insufficient, or even neighbors that don't have their solar system simply become consumers in the grid. And those customers are typically those that are not able to afford their own solar system, so they kind of buy the energy from. We also see that there's like, in regular AC grids, it's relatively easy to steal the energy by simply bypassing the meter, jumping over a cable over the meter, and you immediately have access back to the grid. On a system like this, it's not so simple because the electronics kind of prevent this intrinsically, because the meter at the same time is also an energy conversion unit, bucking it or boosting it up from 12 to 60 or from 60 to 12 volt. So bypassing this will immediately fry either your appliances or cause damage to the grid, or it simply wouldn't work. So it's very hard to steal. And it's an entirely solution. So here in more detail, what does the technology actually do? So the grid itself runs on a 60 volt DC line, and we put 60 volt up for various reasons. It's still relatively cheap to build the electronics on 60 volts. It's safe to touch, so you don't have actual technicians to install those kind of grids. It's 250 watt bidirectional energy transfer from the household to the grid, or from the grid to the household. And when I'm saying household, it could also be, of course, an SME or like a community center or whatever, but it's a connection point per se, basically. And also to keep the communication costs down, each of the devices equipped with a LoRa long-range module. So basically we're becoming our own micro network provider within a village. So the devices are communicating among each other using LoRa technology. And then there's a singular gateway that puts all the data to our backend and visualizes it and gives us data analytics and access to the entire grid. So the status of the technology is what you can see right now. So we have like working test stands in our labs, and we are also having deployed this to Cameroon. So the device currently stacks on top of our solar home systems, but that's just for the prototyping purposes. But we have already designed a new kind of design for the system, which you can see in the bottom left. This is how it's going to look like in the future. And to show you how in reality where we are at the moment, this is our hub in Cameroon, in a village, or let's better say city, called Ngaoundéré, where our R&D hub is at the moment. And just around the R&D hub, we're going to distribute first 10 systems where we can already test at the actual end customer how this is performing, what we need to improve, what the tariff is going to look like. So I think this is the end of the presentation, but if you have questions, of course, in the comment section.
Yeah, thanks very much. And then we would have next the presentation of Daniel Ciganovic by MES SOLshare.
So yeah, hello everyone, this is Daniel. So I don't have an actual presentation in this sense, but yeah, let me speak a little bit about the work we are doing here in Bangladesh. I mean, I think that's maybe one of the most important things to mention directly, that we are working here in Bangladesh, and that's what I also gave the information from my introduction, and also what you mentioned earlier, Jens. The reason why we are working in Bangladesh and why we came up with the model that we are basically deploying in the field is that Bangladesh is a very unique country if you look into electrification. Yes, and I think it was already said in some of the states before, a country where you can learn a lot and see like how does actually an energy infrastructure grow. And of course, in Bangladesh, we are building on this great success of having almost 6 million solar home systems distributed in the field. Maybe this information was already mentioned earlier, but just to get a little bit of an idea, we are talking about like some villages, or an average village in Bangladesh, 25% of the households have a solar home system. And which was for us like a really amazing development me and my co-founders saw from far away from Germany when we were still working there as consultants. But then let me directly go into the products we are building. We have several products, but the main product I would like to talk today is what we call the Sol Bazaar. And the Sol Bazaar, as it already says, it's basically a marketplace where people can trade energy with each other within a community. And why did we think this was needed? So I'm an economist, yes. So I'm one of these guys who always believes like markets can solve everything. Markets can solve inefficiencies and everything. So the inefficiency we saw in Bangladesh was, of course, or as many can imagine, if you have standalone solar home systems, is you will never be able to fully match the actual consumption of a household with the actual system. I think that's also the same problem mini-grids and microgrids have. Yes, that's exactly the point. I think what Nithya mentioned earlier, why it is so important to keep this infrastructure somehow modular. Because especially if you look at a country like Bangladesh, where you see such a fast development, it is impossible to predict what will be, for example, the energy need in 5 years, in 10 years, and so on. But if you put these infrastructures into the field, you need to think about this, but that's almost impossible. So what we basically saw in Bayern was this large distribution of solar home systems, which basically in Bayern was like the first step for electrification. I think it also did fit very good into the culture here in Bangladesh that people often take things into their own hands. It has a history of exactly people taking initiatives, NGOs supporting the government and so on, coming out with the initiative. That was one of the main reasons why Bangladesh was such an amazing country for getting so many solar home systems installed. But as I said, what we saw is when we looked at these systems, we saw around 30% of the energy which such a solar home system generates within a year cannot be utilized. So our straightforward approach is basically, okay, if this energy cannot be utilized, maybe someone else can utilize it. And actually, that's again the story of Bangladesh. This concept of peer-to-peer energy trading, energy sharing, and so on, people actually came up with it themselves. It's nothing like, and the idea is also not that sophisticated and that far obvious. What people in Bangladesh basically did, some people have a solar home system, and I just throw over a cable to my neighbor who maybe doesn't have any energy, and then they make some kind of deal on how much do you pay me for this and not. And that was basically where we also saw that is basically the need you have. Like what happens in these deals, usually they're often very inefficient, because what we might all know, one of the most important things for marketplaces, yes, wherever exchange happens, if it's energy exchange, any kind of good, there needs to be a certain amount of regulation. And that is basically the role we are playing. So that's also why we are seeing ourselves, we are a marketplace and ecosystem facilitator. Why I also mentioned the ecosystem is that in Bangladesh, we also came into a market where most of the parts we need to build our grids, being mainly batteries and PV panels and charge controllers and so on. And especially the financing was already taken care of. So we also have a very big mobile money market. So people are used to just paying things with their mobile phone. All of this is in place. So all we wanted to do is basically create an ecosystem where we allow our partners, like people, organizations already working in the sector, but also especially local communities, to basically make the most of what they already have. Yes, and that was basically the idea when we go back to economics and to markets, to energy markets. It's all about making sure resources are used in the most efficient way. And now again, for us, I mean, we have been doing this since 2015. So in 2015, we basically did build the first peer-to-peer microgrid, or the first, let's call it, energy decentralized energy marketplace in a rural village in Bangladesh. But since then, basically, what we had to look into is basically all these other aspects which come with creating such a market where we actually allow people to trade electricity with each other. So, of course, some of the very important aspects is pricing. But the other very, very important aspect, and that's, I think, that's why often when you look into like typical market approaches, and usually also why is the energy market relatively regulated? The good is so important that you cannot leave it to the free market. Yes. So of course, for example, when we build a grid, we cannot allow when people trade electricity within our grid, that this market is fully deregulated and people can just do what they want, because you will basically start seeing people using their power. Yes, and that's also something you see in local village communities. So what we really try to do is basically making a local energy marketplace which is as much as possible customized towards the communities we are working with. So this starts with energy pricing. We are applying several models there. We have models where we have fixed prices for energy. We tried out models where we go into like more like asset-based pricing, meaning the typical thing is daytime, nighttime tariffs, and so on. Right now, we're also looking into more dynamic pricing experiments, and I think that's all very exciting. The reason why I think this is very exciting, and it's also I think that Victoria might go into later, is this is something you cannot do in the global north. Like what we are basically doing here in Bangladesh, at least for now, is something which is more or less deregulated, which has to do with the history of how all these assets of solar home systems and batteries came into the field, because it's basically like people started to be their own energy provider. So there was no need to regulate this market in such a way. Then it's also, again, yes, now we are starting to interconnect solar home system, letting them trade with each other, but this happens on a community level. So there's really more up to the community how these things happen, and most of them are using their private asset, and they're basically using their own grid. So that is a little bit like some introduction into the work we are doing, and I also would like directly to go a little bit into like what are basically the challenges we have seen with our business model, and we are seeing. The challenge starts, and I think my other co-speakers here can also tell stories about it. The challenge starts the moment regulation kicks in. So for us, the problem right now, where does the regulation kick in, is the problem when the national grid meets our grids. And that is a really big challenge. And that is also still something in the vision we had, yes, for our company. What we want to build is an infrastructure which can grow. Which is nice as long as you stay within your own space, yes, within your own regulation and so on, you let it grow. And that's, again, yes, that's something also you can see in Bangladesh already, where many countries in the world can learn from, that these things always clash. Like in Bangladesh, you already see like people start with a solar home system, and microgrid comes over, runs the solar home system. So solar home system away. Then the national grid comes, microgrid away. So in the end, all we try to do, or all we could do is like try to build the right technology in order to make this happen. In our way, it is, I mean, as I said already, it is really focusing only on the interconnection, because the assets, the financing, and so on is taken over already by organizations here in the market. Yeah, that's more or less this. That's basically what we're focused on, enabling an energy exchange here, and trying to, at least within the space where we are in, trying to learn as much as possible, and maybe also try to give recommendations how to build energy infrastructures that can basically go this kind of path of growing and basically making sure that existing assets, yes, investments that were already made, are not ignored and do not get redundant, but to make use of this. And I think that is one of the most important things, because energy markets in the end are asset and infrastructure heavy, and that's basically where most of the costs come from. So optimizing this as much as possible is for sure key, and is of course one of the key requirements to give as many people as possible in the world access to electricity. That's it. I'm out of time.
Perfect. Thank you. And then as last input, we have Victoria.
Yeah, hi, wow. Great to hear the other speakers and their experiences. And thanks for inviting me. So as mentioned, I work for an investment fund based in Europe. So what I'll kind of offer today and discuss a little is quite a high level overview of what I'm seeing in Europe. And we can, maybe the listeners can compare that to what they were hearing earlier. Feel free to ask me any questions, but it will just be quite a high level overview. So to discuss the kind of market situation here, I think an interesting point to start with is kind of set ventures and what we focus on. So we've always looked at the energy system transition. And 3 years ago, we launched our new fund. And in that fund, we had a few key themes. And one of these themes was prosumerism and communities. And I mean, you can look at that and you can read that as microgrids. And at that time, that was a really hot topic. So we were seeing lots of deals in that space, lots of new companies, lots of concepts. But I can say this year, I've seen very few new deals in this area. What I see is very early stage. Basically, the picture isn't bright for prosumerism and communities in Europe, although I do still believe there is potential. To talk a little bit about that further, the way I kind of view microgrids, I split them into 3 categories. So I see off-grid, which is mainly what we're discussing today. On-grid, where you're using the existing infrastructure, and then quite simplistically hybrid, where you merge existing infrastructure and private infrastructure. So there's lots of terms that are used, you know, virtual power plants and P2P, but I like to simplify it and put them into these 3 buckets. So in Europe, off-grid is not really a big thing, understandably. The main driver for off-grid microgrids is, of course, energy access, and this isn't a huge issue in Europe. So these commercial opportunities are quite limited. Hybrid models do exist, but the cost of building private infrastructure is so much, it's so expensive, that the drivers here are really resilience, the ability for people to be able to island and disconnect from the grid and continue to have access to electricity. Again, a clear driver for that would be natural disasters, but in Europe, this isn't a significant risk. So what you see is this need for resilience needs to be really significant commercially to make it a viable business, because it's going to be like double the cost to make this private infrastructure alongside the existing infrastructure. So some examples could be hospitals or military as well. But if you do this, you do have the most flexibility. So there's a lot of interesting research going on here because you're free from some of the regulatory burden. But at the moment, this is all pilots, it's mainly research. You're not seeing real businesses emerge here. So the main thing we're seeing in Europe is what I call on-grid microgrids. And yeah, you could also look at this like virtual power plants and P2P as well. But it's basically using existing infrastructure and trying to develop new business models. But here is also where, I mean, it's been a running theme throughout this, but regulations cause a lot of problems. When you look at the business models that are emerging here, you can kind of split them again. So you can see business models that view energy more as a commodity. And then you can also see it more as a service. So some businesses look at a microgrid in that what they'll do is they'll enable the customer to get wholesale access to the electricity market. So they can buy electricity at the market price and take a commission of this. But there are lots of challenges in doing this. Another way is more like a PPA structure. So more like a power purchase agreement, but slightly different. Basically, a customer can select a specific provider, a generator. So for example, they want to buy from a specific wind farm and they can pay for that electricity and a business will match this and take a commission that way. And then you have the most complex and very interesting, you have more peer-to-peer trading. So trying to create an energy market at a local level. And there's lots of different ways that people are approaching this. The idea, of course, being that I can buy electricity from my neighbor who has a solar panel, but with regulation, that person cannot directly sell to me. They have to sell to a utility, and then the utility can provide it to me. So there are models emerging, but again, very complicated. The thing that's really getting a lot of attention in Europe, though, is the idea of energy as a service. So kind of a service offering. The idea is that you just pay a flat tariff and you get energy. It's very simple, it's hands-off. You see a few companies offering this now. They'll do the balancing, they'll do kind of all the optimization, also the local optimization, and the customer just pays this fixed monthly fee. Also, they may get reimbursed. So say they have a large battery, they can get paid this fee for the battery to be used to optimize the system. So they can actually earn money as well. And one of the big appeals of this is you can bundle it with other services. So this is getting a lot of attention. You can provide energy as a service, but you can combine it with, heating as a service, I don't know, Netflix. You can throw in, a lot of people are looking at providing an EV as well. So you get EV as a service along with the electricity package. But yeah, this is just some ideas that are emerging. I think the main thing that stands out here, and the reason why I like energy as a service, is that it really focuses on simplicity. And that's what I think businesses always need to come back to for all of these different things, that the system should make sense, but also from the customer perspective, it needs to be really simple. Another 2 key drivers for customers is that it should be green. We're seeing more and more of this now. And where possible, local. Like, as well as that making sense for the system, customers really like locality. They like the idea of their money going to a local solar park or wind farm. You know, you see this in other industries too, like in Europe, you get these boxes now of vegetables. You don't know what the vegetables are, but you know they're going to be organic and they're going to come from a local farmer, and you just pay a fixed fee and it arrives at your door, and you feel good about it. And that's kind of how I see generally trends going, and I think that's the way energy is going to go too. But yeah, I think, to touch a little on the regulation, as it's been mentioned here, is interesting because a lot of these models are really limited, but one of the ways that it works is that you can provide a kind of microgrid within a building. That's the way around it. So if a company is focusing on new build and then wants to provide energy as a service within that build, the regulations are less strict because, the DSO has nothing to do with the internal wiring of the building, so it's not as heavily regulated. And like a really interesting example of kind of the ridiculous situation here is there was a guy in Utrecht. Utrecht is a city near Amsterdam, and he owned a number of schools and he had solar panels on their roofs, and he wanted to just aggregate and distribute within his own buildings with his own solar. But legislation meant that he would have to pay for every kilowatt hour that went onto the grid and every kilowatt hour that came off the grid, despite the fact they were all pretty much next to each other. So what he worked out was that it was actually cheaper to lay his own electricity cables down, dig up the road, and classify it all as a single site. So he built his own infrastructure purely so that he could aggregate solar himself. And yeah, it's just incredible. How is it cheaper to physically connect these buildings than to just use the existing infrastructure? So I hope that gives a slight image of some of the problems that we're facing here. Yeah. I think more can be discussed here, so I'll stop speaking there and open the floor for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We already have 3 questions in the chat. Before we start with these, I would like to ask one question to all 3 of you actual operator or developer of such microgrids or peer-to-peer trading solutions. So let's assume you have these products, you have your different boxes that you developed, and you try to do everything as automatic as possible. Now, how does the system decide on how much electricity to offer to your neighbors and how much to use yourself? Because I can assume that in the evening there might be a high demand in the grid from your neighbors, but you probably also want to operate your own light or your own TV, fridge, whatever appliances you have. So there is a human element to this, but I guess there's also a very automated element to this. So how does this work in your system?
I can speak to that quickly with how we've done it at Okra. And I guess we've just prioritized that the least distance power has to travel, the most efficient it is in the networks as a whole. So that concept really drives in all of the algorithms. So because the houses in our model they are not paying for trading in any capacity, right? They're only paying what they consume. And then the assets distribute power around the network. And that's sort of independent to what the household really has to see or engage with in any way. So the algorithms will prioritize giving power where it's needed locally, like on that house or as close to that house first. And then it basically starts moving farther away as it's no longer needed.
Okay, Daniel, Felix, anything to add from your side?
I can, yeah. I mean, for us, it's also, of course, there is a certain automation, yes, in our meter. So that is the element of our technology which we build ourselves. It's the bidirectional meter, which basically is the interface towards the grid. So the one thing we basically have is like, I mean, of course, we try to look into energy generation is first of all, and that's why you interconnect this system. You need to look into energy generation on an aggregated level, as well as demand on aggregate level. And that's also the typical point where you basically get access to typical diversification effects and make use of this. So the approach then here is actually very simple. You just tell your meter under which conditions to sell energy and under which conditions to buy energy. In our grids, of course, and I guess it's all for the others, of course, the storage is the most relevant element there. So you basically try to look at the storage first. But then, of course, there comes the part which is a little bit, and then for me again as an economist, makes it very tricky. Because the thing is I talked about markets and optimizing and how markets optimize. But what you always need to keep in mind, we are working, at least for us, is we're working in a development context. So normal market mechanisms don't always work. So it's really, and that's something I cannot say we have a standard model there, but based on this, you really need to come up with your model on how do you distribute energy and when should who have access to it. Yes. So you cannot only have, for example, a mechanism which says like the one who pays the most gets the energy. Yes, because that's the one who, for example, shows that each unit of electricity right now has for him or her the highest value. As sometimes you would like to have actually people to get the energy who make the most out of it, but could maybe not compete in a free pricing mechanisms. So as I said, for us, it's basically the first aspect is basically making sure that the energy which is produced right now, that's the starting point first, that should always be used as much as possible, maximize the use of the energy which comes from the panel. The next point is, of course, the batteries is the most important part. So make sure that the batteries, that sufficient energy in the batteries is of course available in the evening, and set the right incentives for it, but also make sure that these batteries don't break. Yes, that's again something, people discharging the batteries until nothing is left and so on. But then the third point, of course, also keep in mind that you're working with a community and that your energy access has a certain amount of development impact, and try to make sure that also you take this into account, that those people get the energy who actually need it the most, which is usually not always signaled through just pricing.
Yeah, I can maybe also say a few words to this. So I mean, even though I said that we don't have it in the field yet, I can more say of like how it's planned at the moment, and it's kind of a technical answer. So like systems are kind of limiting the current that is allowed to be taken out from an individual battery. So you can set this up depending on the solar home system that you actually have. You can also set up the level. And if it's like a proprietary solar home system, you can only really define it by voltage. But if you are installing our solar home system with the mesh device, it also tells you the state of charge. And so gradually, depending on, it's kind of a learning algorithm. So if you find out that the state of charge is literally going to 0 every day because all the entire energy is being discharged into the grid, and then the user doesn't, he or she doesn't have anything left for their own appliances, of course, that's not a great idea. So gradually, this level of discharge allowance per day is lowered or like further brought up, so that kind of there's an equilibrium of what is the self-consumption and what is okay-ish to be sent to the neighbors into the grid. Now, this could theoretically also, of course, lead to instability issues, because as more devices are not willing to feed energy into the grid, more devices are like, more consumer devices will not be able to receive power because there is no more access. So the way we solve this is that voltage is being dropped down independent of the load in the grid, so that heavier loads see a lower voltage due to their consumption and resistances in the grid. And those will be the ones dropping out first. So once an appliance is dropped out, the barrier of reconnecting to the grid is relatively high, so that at least we maintain a minimum of stability in the grid. So the grid remains up for the existing appliances still in the grid, but it can happen that individual users will be dropped out. So it's a bunch of kind of mechanisms that working together, making it as stable as possible. But of course, it can never be guaranteed that it always works. Another mechanism is also that when the battery is being discharged, you don't immediately want to recharge your battery, because you are purchasing energy at a higher price than the price you are actually selling it yourself. So what it does then is that instead of like recharging, it just keeps the voltage at a certain level stable, so that you're really only compensating what you consume, but you don't buy energy back for recharging your battery at this point in time. It doesn't make sense, and it also increases the instability of the grid, because you are for recharging batteries, which most likely would be recharged by solar next day anyways. So it's a bunch of kind of algorithms working together.
Okay, thanks. There's one question about the comparison between DC and AC households. So that's probably a question for SOLshare here, because it's about Bangladesh. So have you ever compared DC households and their appliances with AC households in urban areas in terms of how much energy they use? So it came here that it would save 2/3 of the energy for DC households, which would make these off-grid DC solutions way more efficient.
To be honest, I myself can't give you like any information like how how it exactly plays out is, how much more efficient it is. But I mean, also to give the information, we are also building, as I think the other panelists here, the DC microgrid. So of course, I mean, we are in a DC world, and we of course also appreciate the efficiency of DC. And also, of course, if we see today, yes, most of the relevant appliances, or many of the more and more DC appliances are coming into there. I mean, most of us are right now maybe watching this here from the laptop, and the laptop is actually a DC appliance. The problem is, and that's also something we see in Bangladesh. Yes, the nice thing about it, actually, you had such a big solar home system market, DC systems, that you actually even have maybe one of the biggest DC appliance markets in the world, which grew with it. But even under these conditions, even we in our grids are still struggling with getting these DC appliances out. Why? Because they're usually more expensive. So there are mechanisms to go onto this through financing mechanisms. Yes, and even in Bangladesh, they maybe have one of the most amazing microfinance institutions network in the world. This also still doesn't seem to be efficient. When we talk with the customer and say, like, buy this DC fridge, he says, like, no, I'm going to buy the AC fridge because it's much cheaper. And then they tell me, okay, then I rather have my DC power supply, and then I put it in an inverter and make it into AC and so on. And it's I mean, I totally agree, DC is much more efficient. But at least for us at SOLshare, that we can incentivize the people and try to explain that it might make more sense. But we already took enough on in terms of creating a market. Yes, we are dealing with electricity exchange and so on. That was not a battle we want to take on or are able to take on. Yes, to basically become motivate people more and incentivize them more to use DC appliances. But as I said, what I'm seeing is basically that, unfortunately, AC appliances win quite often because the initial investment cost is just lower.
So there is the question about kind of the national grids in some countries moving closer to the existing off-grids, and they are kind of a threat to your business models here. Probably you can say one word. You said that you have different pricing options, but approximately how much a watt hour or a kilowatt hour of electricity would cost in your system, just as a anchor number. And I guess whenever the national grid would come in, they might be able to offer this at a cheaper rate. So how are you changing or adapting your business models to this threat, in quotation marks, of grid connection?
I guess I can speak to it a little bit. To be honest, I mean, it is something that comes up a lot because various customers do ask about this. Obviously, there's this fear that their assets will, like, they want to know what happens when the grid arrives, and that's logical. But we're also looking, our primary markets are places that are pretty much guaranteed not to get the grid anywhere in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's hundreds of millions of houses across the world. So it's something we talk about. Probably our most viable solution will be something that enables grid, basically grid backup. So kind of pulling in grid electricity when the local generation isn't adequate, but not pushing back out into the grid as kind of an intermediary solution that we might roll out in the next few years. But in the immediate term, there's billions of dollars in just developing purely off-grid solutions, and that's the market that we've chosen to really focus on.
To maybe say a little bit from our part, I mean, of course, the tariff is a problem. It's a huge problem, and it's. I mean, if you talk about buying, I mean, we tried different models in our grid. As I said, we're still doing some dynamic pricing model. We actually even have a model which is being implemented where people are trading the electricity for around $20 per kilowatt hour. But the main problem for us was always, and that's also when we talk about electricity price, the price that somebody pays our grid per unit for electricity is basically the income of somebody else within the community. So it is not like it's people trading it with each other, and most of the money stays within the community. That's how we also often try to justify that in our grids, for example, tariffs are higher than in the national grid. But the biggest problem for me, became so obvious for me, yes, when I looked at our customers and when we designed our business model. My biggest problem was, how can I make the business model attractive enough for the one who sells the electricity? Yes, because if you talk about a private household, these guys need to break even within 18 months. 12 to 24 months. They don't have the same access to financing mechanisms like a big utility. Yes, a power plant might be financed for 30 years. A solar home system, a tiny mini solar power plant, which might be operated by a tiny micro entrepreneur in Bangladesh, he needs to break even within 2 years. So you cannot compete with, but it's still something I always thought, like, this is one of the most obvious and easiest ways to intervene. Beside of all these other subsidies the national grids get when they meet with the grid, which basically there's no way to compete. But on the financing side, that would be something for sure, which could already help a lot and would at least help people in these local communities to also compete with the national grid. Yes, because what we see in our grids is basically those people in the community who are selling, they cannot compete with the national grid. They are losing also the income, yes, they made from selling electricity. And it's not about only us as SolarWorks, it's also about these people in these communities which could potentially sell the electricity, but can now not anymore because you just can't compete with these tariffs.
So maybe a follow-up question on that. Are there any precedents for DC grids being accepted onto the government subsidy regimes that are emerging in Africa? So, for example, results-based financing. Maybe those be active in African countries. Can you say something about this?
Well, I mean, we are active in Africa, and I said we don't have them in the field yet, but I can only speak to the Zambian regulations at the moment. And from the government side, I didn't see any kind of subsidy going for those particularly DC microgrids. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see that they are mentioned in the regulation. And it says that according to the Zambian Energy Regulation Board, it says that grids below 100 kilowatts, in particular, with DC voltages between 45 to 70 volts, are free to choose tariffs as they like. The only thing that you need to do is basically informing the utility about the installation of the grid. And therefore, since you can take whatever money for the kilowatt hour, or you can also offer it as an energy as a service model, it's up to you entirely. So you're also pretty flexible in terms of how to finance this, either by the community or getting external financing. But no, I mean, the answer is, I think there's relatively little direct financing by the government for a DC mini grid. But for AC mini grids, of course, it can look entirely different. There are larger grant schemes in place, put into place by the African or the World Bank. If in Nigeria, for instance, there is money which is channeled to the government and then forwarded to private companies rolling those grids out.
So then I have a follow-up question to Victoria. You said it already in your introductory statement, but we have this question twice in the chat and the Q&A. So what can the Global North actually learn from the Global South, and probably also vice versa, if you feel obliged to answer this? Yeah,
I briefly touched on it at the start. I think the key point, and also what I'm hearing from people, but it's the fact that because, well, within Europe anyway, we're so encumbered by regulations and the costs of things. Actually, things are really over-engineered here, and they have to be. And what I think already is taking place, that people are managing to build a robust and reliable or a good enough infrastructure at a very low cost. Whereas in Europe, you have to spend a fortune basically and invest a lot of time. And that's stifling innovation. And then, yeah, I mentioned that in the future, I really see the future for a P2P microgrid is going to take place in the global south way before it can happen here. So the learning will be that way around. But I think this question is for the other panelists as well. I would be interested in their thoughts on this.
I can say a little bit. I mean, I think we agree with everything you've said. I mean, we say this often, we've never been able to basically deploy and iterate and prototype and develop our technology the way we were able to in Cambodia if we were trying to do it on the Australian national grid. That just wouldn't have been possible. And we're basically at a point now where the energy technology is actually more advanced than many of the national grids in our respective kind of developed countries. The way that we can really granularly monitor, automate, optimize energy transmission and distribution is really unparalleled compared to kind of big energy infrastructure. And we're seeing it collapse in places like the US. And so I think there's huge learnings of the benefits of decentralized, using new tech where it's possible. And yeah, we've been able to experiment very rapidly with that because we're not encumbered by a lot of regulation, especially at the small scale. Obviously, we start hitting those walls of regulation as we try to hit scale, which is kind of what I was talking about. But in the early days, yeah, these markets have really been beneficial for us.
Okay, thanks. I have so many more questions about end of life time of your products, recycling, local value creation, and so on, but we're already out of time. So I would just would like to ask one final question to each of you. So same question to each of you. So if you would just wake up tomorrow morning and you basically had the full regulatory power at your hands, what would you change in terms of microgrids and P2P trading? And maybe we just start in the reverse order. So Victoria first, please.
Sure. I think I would go straight for the transmission fee structure. So I don't think you should be paying for infrastructure that you do not use. So if you can prove that you have a local off-taker and you're generating electricity, then I don't see that you should have to pay a transmission fee. And I think in doing this, you can generate a lot more commercially viable business models. So yeah, I would go with that.
Thanks, Daniel.
I have to say, I mean, I even though I come originally from Germany or from the Western country, I don't know the regulations of these energy markets that well. But
the question is open also to any global South countries. Yeah. So whatever.
So, but then for sure, looking at it from the Bangladesh context, yeah, the main problem with the regulation is, and that's what it's about, like, find a way to basically allow the private, even the private households, I'm not talking about private companies and so on, to participate in the national grid, especially which is for me something which is relatively astonishing that this. I mean, sometimes it is astonishing that it had not been more considered, but looking at a country like Bangladesh with such a vast deployment of solar home system, meaning solar panels and storage, there should be a regulation which allows the solar home system to be integrated into the national grid, and especially also which incentivize these battery owners to also make their batteries available to contribute into the national grid.
Okay, and Felix?
Yeah, I kind of want to echo this. Currently, most of the DESCO companies in Africa, they're operating somewhat in a gray zone because technically they're selling energy to end customers, which somehow makes them a micro utility. But also then going further to those microgrids, they're very often not at all regulated. So as I said, in the example of Zambia, there is a mentioning in the regulations, but it doesn't really say, will they change it in the future? And really adding a little bit more detail to it, because if you start deploying on a larger scale those kind of grids into areas, and then all of a sudden regulation changes, and for instance, they say, now for those grids, same tariffs apply as we have in an AC grid. you are screwed basically. Yeah. So and to give you a little bit of planability, governments would really like look into this, see it as a viable option for the future, and regulate it according to what technology we provide at what cost, you know, and really giving like a plan ahead, so we can really start deploying this from the private sector side.
Okay, thanks, Nithya.
I mean, I agree with everything Felix just said. I think that's super important, and that kind of regulatory pathway and legality is crucial for investors as well. But I'll also just add that kind of open subsidies, tenders that allow any technology to bid, as long as, you know, if you require 1 kWh per day for this many households, or whatever the requirement is, lifting the restrictions that it has to be very specific types of technology. I think we want to promote innovation and rapid development and deployment of all these really cool techs that are being developed. And subsidies really just bite us when they artificially promote technology that isn't doing as good of a job. So that would be one of the things we would add.
Okay, thanks very much. And I would say that's actually a good ending. So we hope that this leapfrogging advantage that you altogether have already built is not being lost by incoming grid connections with very dirty electricity and tariffs that are too low and subsidized. So let's just hope this is all ongoing. So thank you very much for coming and for joining the panel and sharing all your insights. It was very interesting. I guess, as I said, so many more questions, but I guess there will be other opportunities to discuss this as well. So it's the end of the first day of the conference already, but not the end of the full conference. So we invite everyone to join again tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m. Berlin time or 2 p.m. Dhaka time, or any other time you're joining from. And check out the program for tomorrow. And yeah, happy to see you all back. So thanks very much.